The fire crackled in the stone hearth of the Mitchell Ranch parlor, casting dancing shadows across the weathered face of Captain Jacob Iron Horse Mitchell. At 77 years old, his shoulders still carried the ramrod posture of a cavalry officer, though time had silvered his hair, white as Montana snow, and etched deep lines around eyes that had witnessed the birth of a territory. The hands that now held a simple coffee cup had once gripped cavalry sabers and Colt revolvers, had signed death warrants for cattle rustlers, and had trembled as they buried the two people he'd loved most in this harsh world. Outside the ranch house windows, December snow fell thick as cotton batting, each flake catching the lamplight before disappearing into the growing drifts that would soon make the mountain roads impassable. It was the kind of storm that reminded old-timers of the winter of 1881, when the territory had nearly frozen solid and changed the course of 3 lives forever. David Mitchell, 15 years old and possessed of that restless energy that marked boys on the edge of manhood, leaned forward in his grandfather's favorite leather chair. The boy had been pestering Jacob for weeks about the faded sepia photograph that held place of honor on the mantel. In it, a beautiful woman with kind eyes and prematurely gray hair stood beside 3 children in front of a large wooden building. Above the entrance, carved letters spelled out Harper House in elegant script. "Tell me about great-grandmother Elena," David said, his voice carrying that peculiar blend of respect and impatience that marked teenage curiosity. "Not the sanitized version you tell at church socials. The real story, how you really met her." Jacob's gnarled fingers, marked with the scars of a lifetime spent working with horses, cattle, and occasionally violent men, traced the rim of his coffee cup. The steam rose like ghosts in the warm lamplight, and for a moment the old soldier was transported back across 47 years to a time when Montana Territory was still bleeding from the Indian Wars, and justice came from the barrel of a gun. Some stories, Jacob had learned, demanded to be told in their own time. This was such a story, not the romantic tale of rescue and redemption that the church ladies preferred, but the harder truth of how 2 broken souls had found wholeness in each other during the worst winter in territorial history. "There are winters in Montana that can freeze a man's soul clean through," Jacob began, his voice carrying the weight of decades and the authority of a man who'd seen civilization carved from wilderness. "But that winter when I was 30 years old and thought I knew everything about survival, I witnessed a transaction that would change 3 lives forever." The old man's eyes grew distant, seeing not the comfortable parlor of 1928 with its electric lights and modern conveniences, but the brutal landscape of 1881, a time when the nearest law might be 100 miles away, when disputes were settled with Winchester rifles, and when human beings could be bought and sold like livestock in broad daylight. It was December 1881. The worst winter storm in Montana Territory's recorded history was just beginning to show its teeth, and I was about to learn that sometimes the coldest thing in a blizzard isn't the wind. The storm struck Frost Ridge like the wrath of an angry god, driving snow horizontally across the settlement with winds that howled like the voices of the damned. Captain Jacob Mitchell hunched deeper into his cavalry graycoat as his Appaloosa stallion, Thunder, picked his way carefully down the treacherous slope toward the huddle of buildings that passed for civilization in this corner of Montana Territory. The thermometer at the town's general store, if it had still been intact after the wind got hold of it, would have read 25 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit. The kind of cold that could kill a man in 15 minutes if he wasn't prepared, that turned spit to ice before it hit the ground, that made every breath feel like inhaling razors. But Jacob Mitchell had spent 15 years preparing for weather like this, ever since he'd enlisted in the 7th Cavalry at the tender age of 15. He'd ridden with Custer's men before the disaster at Little Bighorn, though fortune and a bout of dysentery had kept him from that fatal field. He'd learned to read the sky like scripture and the wind like a battle plan during campaigns against the Apache in Arizona Territory. Later, as a Texas Ranger, he'd tracked killers across Badlands, where the sun could cook a man as dead as any blizzard. Now, at 30, he carried himself with the quiet confidence of a professional survivor, a man who'd made his living by being faster, smarter, and more ruthless than the human predators who thrived in the lawless territories. Thunder's ears swiveled forward, the horse's superior senses detecting danger that Jacob's own carefully honed instincts confirmed a moment later. There was wrongness in the air, something beyond the natural violence of the storm. The settlement's chimneys should have been smoking steadily against the cold, but several were cold and dark. Frostridge looked like a town holding its breath. Jacob's hand instinctively moved to check the Colt Peacemaker holstered at his right hip. The weapon was loaded with 5 rounds, hammer resting on an empty chamber for safety. A second Colt rode in his saddlebags, along with a Winchester Model 1873 rifle and enough ammunition to fight a small war. 15 years of staying alive in hostile territory had taught him that being overprepared was infinitely preferable to being dead. The town of Frost Ridge clung to the hillside like a desperate man clutching a cliff face. Perhaps 30 buildings in total, ranging from substantial log structures to ramshackle lean-tos that wouldn't survive the winter. The rusty saloons squatted at the settlement's heart, yellow lamplight bleeding through ice-crusted windows like infected wounds. It was toward this establishment that Jacob had tracked Marcus Sullivan's gang of cattle rustlers, following a trail of stolen livestock and worse crimes across 3 territories. But as he guided Thunder toward the saloon's hitching post, a sound cut through the wind that made his blood run cold as the Montana air. A woman's scream, sharp, desperate, carrying a note of agony that spoke of more than mere physical injury. It was the cry of someone who'd been hurt before, often, and knew that worse was coming. Jacob dismounted in one fluid motion, the kind of practiced efficiency that marked a man who'd dismounted under fire more times than he cared to count. His cavalry boots crunched through snow 18 inches deep as he approached the saloon's rear window, moving with the silent grace of a hunter stalking dangerous prey. What he saw through the frost-rimmed glass stopped him cold as the winter storm itself. A young woman, perhaps 21 years of age, knelt on the rough plank floor of the saloon's back room. Blood trickled from the corner of her mouth, stark red against skin pale as driven snow. Her dress was little more than assembled rags, offering no protection against the bitter cold that seeped through every gap and chink in the building's construction. Worse than her obvious poverty was the catalog of injuries visible on her exposed skin, bruises in various stages of healing, burn marks that looked suspiciously deliberate, scars that spoke of systematic torture. But it was her eyes that struck Jacob like a physical blow. Blue as high country sky, they held no tears. Fear, yes. Pain, certainly. But also a resignation that spoke of suffering beyond her years, of hope systematically crushed until nothing remained but endurance. Standing over her like a monstrous caricature of authority was a heavy-set man with the red-faced complexion of a habitual drunk. Cyrus Harper wielded a leather belt with brass buckle like a weapon, bringing it down across the woman's shoulders with methodical precision. Each blow produced a sound like a pistol shot, but the woman made no outcry. She'd learned, Jacob realized with growing fury, that crying only made the punishment worse. "Damn you to hell," Harper roared, spittle flying from his lips to freeze in the frigid air. "Because of you, Isaac Barnes is dead. Who's going to pay me the $50 now? Who's going to make good my loss?" Jacob's weathered hand found the saloon's back door, unlocked, as most frontier establishments rarely bothered with such niceties when everyone carried guns and settled disputes with lead. He stepped inside, bringing the storm's chill with him and causing the lamplight to flicker ominously. "That's enough." His voice carried 15 years of command authority, low but unmistakably military, the kind of tone that had once ordered cavalry charges and directed artillery fire. Harper spun around, bloodshot eyes taking in Jacob's appearance, with the calculating look of a man who'd survived by accurately measuring threats. The stranger before him was clearly military, despite wearing civilian clothes. The erect posture, the way his right hand rested casually but precisely near his gun, the cold assessment in eyes that had seen too much death to be intimidated by a small-town bully. Harper's bravado faltered slightly, but alcohol and rage kept him aggressive. "This ain't your concern, soldier boy," Harper slurred, though uncertainty crept into his voice like fog rolling off a lake. "Captain Mitchell," Jacob corrected, ice forming in his tone, "and a man beating a defenseless woman is always my concern." The young woman looked up at him then, and Jacob felt something fundamental shift in his chest. Her eyes held a spark he hadn't expected, an intelligence that 8 years of brutality hadn't managed to extinguish. Not hope, exactly, She was too worn down for that precious emotion. But curiosity, interest, as if she was trying to puzzle out what manner of man would step between a complete stranger and her tormentor. "Name's Cyrus Harper," the drunk said, as if the designation should carry weight in civilized conversation. "This here's my ward, legally appointed by the territorial court. I got papers that say she's my responsibility." Jacob's gaze moved deliberately between Harper and the woman, reading the story written in bruises and scars across her exposed flesh. Old injuries, poorly healed, burns that looked suspiciously like brand marks, fingernails torn down to the quick. This wasn't discipline or even cruel punishment. This was systematic torture, the deliberate breaking of a human spirit. "What's your name, miss?" Jacob addressed the woman directly, ignoring Harper's proprietorial scowl. She hesitated, glancing nervously at Harper before answering in a voice barely above a whisper. "Elena. Elena Harper." "Tell me what happened to Isaac Barnes." The question hung in the freezing air like smoke from a discharged firearm. Elena's eyes darted again to Harper, who raised the belt threateningly. But something in Jacob's steady presence seemed to give her courage. "He tried to force himself on me," she said, each word carefully chosen. "When I refused, he became violent. I managed to grab a carving knife from the table. When he wouldn't stop his attack, I defended myself. He fell backward and struck his head on the corner of the bar." Self-defense. Jacob had seen enough violence in his 30 years to recognize truth when he heard it spoken. The woman's account had the ring of authenticity, the kind of stark honesty that came from someone who'd learned that lies only made punishment worse. But Harper's next words revealed a reality far darker than simple assault. "The bastard paid me $50 in advance for her services," Harper snarled, apparently unaware that he was confessing to procuring prostitution. "Now he's dead and I'm out the money. That Chinese doctor says she won't give me anything for the body, claims it was self-defense." Self-defense, as if this worthless creature has any right to defend herself against her betters. The admission hung in the stale air like gunpowder smoke. Harper had just confessed to human trafficking, to forcing the woman into prostitution, possibly to facilitating rape. In any civilized territory, such an admission would see him decorating a hanging tree before sunset, but Frost Ridge was far from any meaningful law enforcement. "So you're selling her," Jacob said. The words weren't phrased as a question. "Marcus Sullivan's coming tomorrow morning," Harper confirmed with obvious satisfaction. "He's offered 3 good horses and $100 in gold coin. Says he's got buyers down in Mexico who pay premium prices for young women, especially ones that have been properly broken to obedience." Marcus Sullivan. Jacob's jaw tightened at the name, muscle jumping beneath the weather-beaten skin. 5 years earlier, as a Texas Ranger operating along the Rio Grande, he'd tracked Sullivan's human trafficking operation across 3 states. The man was a predator of the worst sort, specializing in young women and children whom he sold to brothels and worse establishments south of the border. Sullivan's buyers were slave masters who worked their human property to death in mines and plantations where no law could reach. Letting Elena fall into Sullivan's hands wouldn't be a sale. It would be a death sentence, probably preceded by months or years of unspeakable suffering. "I'll pay more," Jacob heard himself say, the words emerging before conscious thought could stop them. Harper's piggy eyes lit up with avarice, the kind of naked greed that marked men who'd sell their own mothers for the right price. "You got that kind of money, stranger?" Jacob pulled out his leather wallet, worn soft from years of constant carry. Inside was everything he'd managed to save during his military service, and subsequent work as a tracker and occasional bounty hunter. $200 in gold certificates and silver coins, representing his entire accumulated wealth. His future, his security, his plan for eventually buying a small ranch and settling down. $200 gold, Jacob said, counting out the bills with steady hands. "Plus I'll throw in 5 horses. Good stock." Harper's greed overcame what little caution the alcohol had left him, his eyes fixed on the money like a starving man staring at fresh bread. "You got yourself a deal, Captain," Harper said, extending a meaty hand. "But I want this legal and proper. Don't need Sullivan coming after me, claiming I cheated him out of merchandise." Jacob's Texas Ranger training then asserted itself. Under Montana Territorial Law, Section 47, A legal guardian can transfer custody through proper documentation. I want a written contract, signed, dated, and witnessed by at least two neutral parties. The next 30 minutes passed in a blur of legal formalities. Harper, sobering slightly as he contemplated his windfall, produced the necessary paperwork from a battered strongbox. The transfer of custody was recorded in the territorial ledger by the town's part-time clerk, witnessed by the saloon keeper and the blacksmith. Elena Harper officially became Jacob Mitchell's legal responsibility, purchased for $200 and 5 horses. Throughout the entire proceeding, Elena sat silent on a rough wooden stool, watching the transaction that would determine her fate with the same resigned acceptance she might have shown for a discussion of the weather. She was property being transferred from one owner to another. Her opinions, her desires, her fears, none of it mattered in the eyes of the law or the men who wielded it. Only when the papers were signed and Harper had counted his money twice did Jacob address her directly. Miss Elena, I need you to understand something. I haven't bought you. I've bought you time to decide what you want to do with your life. She looked at him with confusion, clear in those remarkable blue eyes. I don't understand. I'm taking you away from here, to somewhere safe. After that, the choice is yours. You can stay, you can go wherever you want, or you can ask me to help you find family or work somewhere else. But the decision will be yours to make. The concept seemed utterly foreign to her. She stared at him as if he'd spoken in a language she didn't recognize. No one's ever asked me what I wanted, she said finally, wonder creeping into her voice. Then it's about time someone did. Jacob helped her to her feet, noting how she flinched away from physical contact despite his careful gentleness. Harper had trained her to expect pain from any human touch. It would take time and patience to undo that conditioning, if it could be undone at all. Where are my things? Jacob asked. Elena's laugh held no humor. I don't have any things, just what you see. Jacob looked at her threadbare dress, her bare feet blue with cold, the complete absence of any personal possessions. Harper hadn't just enslaved her. He'd stripped away every trace of her individual identity, reducing her to nothing more than a commodity to be traded. We'll remedy that, Jacob said grimly. But first, we need to get out of this storm. He wrapped his cavalry greatcoat around her slight shoulders, the heavy wool dwarfing her small frame. The coat had seen him through campaigns against the Apache, through blizzards in the Dakotas, through gunfights in a dozen frontier towns. Now it would protect someone who needed it far more than he did. Leading Elena through the storm to where thunder waited, Jacob helped her mount behind him. Her hands gripped his waist with desperate strength as the big stallion began picking his way up the treacherous mountain trail that led to Jacob's hidden cabin. The wind had picked up, driving snow so thick it was like riding through a white tunnel. Visibility dropped to mere yards, and the cold bit through their clothing with savage intensity. Elena pressed against Jacob's back, seeking warmth and shelter, and he could feel her shivering despite the heavy coat. Where are we going? She asked, her voice barely audible over the howling wind. My cabin, Jacob replied, keeping Thunder to a steady pace that wouldn't risk a stumble on the icy trail. About 5 miles up the mountain. It's hidden, defensible, and stocked with everything we'll need to wait out the storm. And after the storm? Jacob was quiet for a long moment, considering his answer. After the storm, Miss Elena, you'll have to decide who you want to be. The trail wound upward through stands of pine and spruce, their branches heavy with snow that fell in soft whispers to the forest floor. Jacob's cabin lay hidden in a natural clearing where a man could see anyone approaching from 3 directions while having an escape route through the 4th. He'd built it during his first winter in Montana, a refuge for times when the civilized world became too complicated or dangerous. As they crested the final ridge, the cabin came into view, a solid structure built from logs Jacob had cut and chinked himself. Smoke rose from the chimney, indicating that the fire he'd banked before leaving was still burning. Light glowed warmly in the single window, a beacon of safety in the howling wilderness. It's beautiful, Elena said softly, and Jacob realized it was the first time he'd heard genuine pleasure in her voice. The cabin's interior reflected its owner's military background, everything clean, organized, and functional. One main room served as kitchen, dining area, and parlor, with a stone fireplace dominating one wall. A simple bed occupied one corner, while a rough-hewn table and two chairs filled another. Books lined makeshift shelves, volumes on law, tactics, and the classics that Jacob's educated mother had insisted he read before joining the army at 15. On the mantel above the fireplace sat a daguerreotype in a simple silver frame, a woman with golden hair and kind eyes holding a small boy of perhaps 4 years. Both were smiling, captured in a moment of happiness that seemed to glow in the lamplight. Elena stood in the center of the room, afraid to touch anything, overwhelmed by the simple comfort of it all. After 8 years of sleeping on straw in Harper's cold barn, the warm cabin seemed impossibly luxurious. Jacob knelt by the fireplace, building up the banked coals with practiced efficiency. The flames caught quickly, sending warmth spreading through the small space and driving the winter chill from the walls. "This is your home?" Elena asked, still standing uncertainly in the middle of the room. "Temporary quarters," Jacob replied, feeding carefully selected pieces of dry kindling to the growing fire. "I built it for times when I need to disappear for a while, when tracking fugitives or when the civilized world gets too complicated." Elena's gaze found the photograph on the mantel, drawn to the happiness captured in those faces. "Your family?" Jacob's hands stilled on the firewood, his entire body tensing as if preparing for a physical blow. The lines around his eyes deepened, and his voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "They were. Rose and Danny. They died 3 years ago." "I'm sorry," Elena said and meant it. She knew the weight of loss, the way it could hollow out your chest and leave you walking through life like a ghost. "It was a blizzard," Jacob said, the words dropping like stones into still water. "Worse than tonight's storm, if you can imagine such a thing. I was away on a mission, tracking a gang of cattle rustlers down in Wyoming territory. The trail was hot, and I thought I could wrap up the job and be back within a week." He paused, staring into the growing flames as if they might show him a different past. "Rose took Danny out to check on the livestock when the storm hit. It came up fast, the way they sometimes do in the mountains. Whiteout conditions, wind strong enough to knock a man down. They got lost between the barn and the house, froze to death 20 yards from safety." Elena moved closer to the fireplace, drawn by its warmth and by an impulse to comfort this man who'd shown her more kindness in one evening than she'd received in 8 years. "When did you find them?" "5 days later, when the storm finally broke," Jacob replied, his voice steady, but his hands shaking as he adjusted the burning logs. "I rode back expecting to find them worried but safe. Instead, I found their bodies under a snowdrift near the corral fence. Danny was still holding his mother's hand. The image hung between them, stark and terrible. Elena could picture it, the small boy clutching his mother's fingers even in death, both of them so close to safety, but unable to find their way through the blinding snow. "It wasn't your fault," she said quietly. Jacob looked at her sharply, his eyes reflecting firelight and old pain. "How would you know?" "Because I know what guilt looks like," Elena replied, settling carefully onto the floor near the hearth. "I've carried it for 8 years, wondering what I did wrong, what I could have done differently. Every beating, every cruel word, every night locked in the cellar. I used to think if I was better, if I tried harder, maybe Cyrus would treat me like family instead of property." The admission hung between them like a bridge built of shared suffering. Jacob had rescued this woman expecting to feel nothing but duty toward a stranger in need. Instead, he found himself studying her face in the firelight, noting the intelligence in her remarkable eyes, the subtle strength in her bearing, despite years of systematic abuse. Without conscious thought, he began preparing food: jerky, hardtack, and coffee strong enough to dissolve horseshoe nails. Army rations, simple but nourishing. Elena accepted the plate with hands that trembled slightly, not from cold, but from hunger. She ate like someone who hadn't seen food in days, which, as it turned out, wasn't far from the truth. "When did you last have a proper meal?" Jacob asked, watching her devour the simple fare with obvious desperation. 3 days ago, Elena admitted between bites. "Cyrus doesn't feed me when he's angry, and he's angry most of the time lately. His gambling debts are piling up, and he owes money to some dangerous people." Jacob felt that familiar cold rage building in his chest, the same controlled fury that had served him well in combat against Apache warriors and Mexican bandits. But this anger was different, more personal. touched with a protective instinct he hadn't felt since Rose and Danny's death. "Tell me about your parents," he said, partly to distract himself from thoughts of what he'd like to do to Cyrus Harper, partly because he genuinely wanted to know about the people who'd raised this remarkable woman. Elena's face transformed, the hard lines of constant vigilance softening into something approaching peace. They were good people. The best. Papa was a carpenter, made furniture for folks all over the territory. He had these huge, gentle hands that could carve the most delicate patterns in wood. Mama had the prettiest garden you ever saw, roses and wildflowers and vegetables that grew better than anyone else's. She paused, lost in memory. They loved each other so much. Even after being married for 15 years, Papa would still bring Mama flowers every Friday. She'd blush like a schoolgirl and pretend to scold him for being foolish, but I could see how happy it made her. How did they die? Fever, some kind of sickness that came through on a wagon train. Took Papa first, then Mama 2 days later. I was 13, old enough to nurse them, but too young to understand why God would take away the only good thing in my life. Jacob heard the echo of his own loss in her words, the bewilderment of someone who'd learned too young that the universe was indifferent to human happiness. "And Harper was your only family?" "Papa's half-brother. I'd never met him before the funeral, but when the territorial lawyer said he was my closest living relative, I thought, I hoped he'd take care of me the way Papa would have wanted." Instead, Harper had turned her into a slave, working her like an animal while slowly breaking her spirit with systematic cruelty. Jacob kept this observation to himself as he banked the fire for the night, adding logs that would burn slowly and keep the cabin warm until morning. "You take the bed," he told Elena, gesturing toward the simple wooden frame with its rope mattress and wool blankets. "I'll sleep by the fire." Elena looked uncertain. "I couldn't take your bed." "You can and you will. I've slept on harder ground than this cabin floor more times than I can count." Jacob spread his bedroll near the fireplace, keeping his rifle within easy reach. Old habits from too many nights in hostile territory, when the difference between waking up and dying in your sleep often came down to keeping your weapons close. But despite his exhaustion, sleep proved elusive. Every few hours he found himself checking the windows, listening for sounds that didn't belong to the natural symphony of wind and settling snow. Something felt wrong, though he couldn't identify what triggered his unease. Dawn came gray and cold, with snow still falling steadily outside the cabin's thick walls. Jacob woke to the sound of horses, multiple riders moving carefully up the trail. He was on his feet instantly, rifle in hand, peering through the frost-covered window at shapes materializing through the swirling snow. 6 men, maybe 7, spread out in a rough circle around the cabin. Professional positioning that spoke of military training or extensive experience with violence. These weren't random drifters or casual troublemakers. These men had come with a specific purpose. Elena stirred as Jacob checked his ammunition supply with practiced efficiency. 15 rounds for the Winchester, 6 for each of his Colts, plus 2 full boxes of cartridges in his gear. Against 7 mounted men with rifles, it might not be enough. "Elena," he whispered urgently, "get down behind the bed and stay there. Don't make a sound until I tell you." A voice boomed across the clearing, cutting through the morning air like a cavalry saber. "Iron Horse, I know you're in there." Marcus Sullivan. The name hit Jacob like a physical blow, dragging up memories he tried to bury along with too many other ghosts. Sullivan's voice carried the same arrogant confidence Jacob remembered from their last encounter 5 years earlier in Texas, when the bastard had escaped a perfectly planned raid by sacrificing his own men as a distraction. "You can't run forever, Mitchell," Sullivan continued, his voice carrying easily over the wind. "This time you don't have the Rangers to back your play." Jacob positioned himself at the window, calculating angles of fire and available cover. The cabin's thick log walls would stop pistol rounds, but wouldn't offer much protection against rifle fire. His advantages were limited: interior lines, detailed knowledge of the terrain, and unlimited motivation to protect the woman cowering behind his bed. "10 minutes, Iron Horse," Sullivan called out. "Send out the girl, and maybe I'll let you live long enough to regret crossing me." Elena crawled over to where Jacob crouched by the window, her face pale but determined. "Who is he?" Someone I should have killed 5 years ago when I had the chance, Jacob replied grimly. And now he's here for you. But even as he spoke, Jacob realized Sullivan's arrival was no coincidence. The timing was too perfect. The knowledge of Elena's location too precise. Someone had told Sullivan exactly where to find them. Someone who knew about the cabin's location and Jacob's habits. Elena, he said slowly, a terrible suspicion forming in his mind. Yesterday, after I bought your contract from Harper, did anyone else know you were coming with me? She thought for a moment, then shook her head. Just Dr. Chen. She was there when we left the saloon. Who exactly is Dr. Chen? The Chinese doctor in town? She's been watching over me since my parents died. Not openly, but I've seen her sometimes, and she's treated my injuries when they were too serious for me to hide. The pieces clicked together in Jacob's mind like chambers rotating in a revolver cylinder. Dr. Chen, the mysterious benefactor who'd apparently been tracking Elena's situation for 8 years. Either she was more than she seemed, or someone else entirely had been manipulating events from the shadows. Before Jacob could process this revelation further, the cabin door rattled as if someone was testing the latch from outside. Both he and Elena froze, weapons trained on the wooden barrier that separated them from Sullivan's men. But instead of armed killers, the door opened to admit a small figure shaking snow from a heavy wool coat. A boy, maybe 12 years old, with bright blue eyes and toweled brown hair that stuck up in defiant cowlicks despite the wool cap he wore. Pa, are you in here? Tommy Bennett. Jacob's heart stopped for a moment as he recognized the orphan boy he'd rescued from cattle rustlers the previous summer. The child who'd taken to calling him Pa with such fierce devotion that it made Jacob's chest ache with memories of Danny. Tommy! Jacob grabbed the boy, pulling him away from the door and any possible line of fire from outside. What in God's name are you doing here? I heard about Marcus Sullivan coming to town, Tommy said breathlessly, his words tumbling over each other in his excitement to explain. Mrs. Patterson at the general store was talking to the blacksmith about it. She said Sullivan was looking for you and some woman. I knew you were in trouble, so I snuck out and followed your trail. Elena stared at this new arrival with confusion clear on her face. This is your son? Adopted, Jacob explained quickly, never taking his eyes off the windows where Sullivan's men were surely positioning themselves for an assault. I found Tommy after his parents were killed in a Sioux raid last summer. Tommy, this is Miss Elena. She'll be staying with us for a while. Tommy studied Elena with the frank curiosity of childhood, apparently unconcerned by the desperate nature of their situation. Despite the armed men surrounding the cabin and the very real possibility of imminent violence, he smiled at her with genuine warmth. Does this mean you'll be my new ma? He asked with the devastating directness that only children possessed. The innocent question struck both adults like a physical blow. Jacob and Elena looked at each other across the small cabin, and something passed between them that had nothing to do with rescue or gratitude or even the peculiar intimacy of shared danger. It was recognition, the sudden understanding that perhaps 3 broken people might somehow become a family. I'd like that very much, Elena said softly, her voice carrying wonder at the possibility. But outside, Sullivan's voice cut through their moment of connection like a saber blade through silk. Time's up, Iron Horse. You've got 30 seconds to send out the girl, or we start shooting. Jacob looked at Elena and Tommy, these 2 people who had somehow become his responsibility in the space of 12 hours. For 3 years after Rose and Danny's death, he'd been going through the motions of living, existing, but not truly alive. Now, suddenly, he had something worth fighting for again. Elena, he said, his voice carrying the authority of 15 years of military command. I need you to make a choice. I can try to get you out of here, find another way to safety, or we can make our stand together, all 3 of us. But I won't force you into anything. The decision has to be yours. Elena looked at him, then at Tommy, who was watching her with those bright, trusting eyes, then at the daguerreotype of Rose and Danny on the mantel. She thought of 8 years spent in submission, of believing herself powerless, of accepting that her fate belonged to other people who cared nothing for her welfare. I'm tired of running, she said, surprising herself with the strength in her voice. I'm tired of being afraid, Tired of letting other people decide what happens to me, Jacob handed her the spare Colt from his saddlebags, the weapon that had once belonged to Rose. Then we fight, together. But as the words left his mouth, a new realization chilled him more thoroughly than the Montana winter. Sullivan hadn't tracked them through superior woodcraft or lucky guesswork. Someone had betrayed their location. Someone who knew about Elena's situation, about the cabin's existence, about Jacob's movements and habits. The game they were playing was larger than a simple rescue, more complex than a straightforward confrontation between good and evil. Somewhere in the swirling snow outside, forces were moving on a board that Jacob was only beginning to understand. Elena Harper, the woman who'd been sold for 2 mules and 5 horses on a winter morning in Montana territory, was about to discover that her story was far from over. In fact, it was just beginning. The wind howled outside like a living thing with hunger and malice, and in the distance, Marcus Sullivan began to laugh. The morning sun struggled to penetrate the thick blanket of storm clouds that had settled over the Montana mountains like a gray shroud of impending doom. Inside Jacob's cabin, the temperature had dropped so low that breath formed visible clouds even near the fireplace. Captain Jacob Mitchell crouched by the frost-covered window, his experienced eyes cataloging the positions of Sullivan's men through the steadily falling snow that had been accumulating since before dawn. 6 riders, possibly 7, spread out in a tactical formation that spoke unmistakably of military training or extensive experience with organized violence. Their positioning was textbook perfect: overlapping fields of fire, covered approaches, escape routes secured. These weren't random drifters or opportunistic criminals. These men had come prepared for war. "Iron Horse!" Marcus Sullivan's voice boomed across the clearing like thunder, carrying easily over the howling wind that bent the pine trees almost horizontal. "I know you're in there, you yellow-bellied son of a bitch! Time to pay for what you cost me in Texas!" Jacob felt his jaw muscles tighten as he recognized the voice that had haunted his nightmares for 5 long years. Through the swirling snow, he could make out Sullivan's massive silhouette, a mountain of a man with shoulders like a prize bull and hands that had strangled the life from more victims than Jacob cared to contemplate. At 40 years old, Marcus Sullivan had built an empire in human misery, and his scarred face told the story of a man who'd survived everything the frontier could throw at him. Elena pressed herself against the cabin wall beside the window, her face pale but her blue eyes alert and focused. The transformation in her demeanor since yesterday was remarkable. Gone was the cowering, broken woman who'd knelt in Cyrus Harper's saloon. In her place stood someone harder, more determined, shaped by circumstances into something approaching a warrior. Tommy, though still just 12, displayed remarkable composure as he assisted Jacob with organizing their ammunition supply. Having lost his parents in an Indian attack and lived rough for over a year, the boy possessed wisdom beyond his years about the harsh realities of frontier survival. "Elena," Jacob said quietly, never taking his eyes off the window where he could see Sullivan's men shifting positions like wolves preparing for a coordinated attack. "I need you to understand exactly what kind of man we're dealing with out there. Marcus Sullivan isn't just another outlaw or even a particularly successful bandit. He's something far worse." Jacob positioned himself to cover the cabin's main approach while continuing his explanation, his voice carrying the weight of hard experience. 5 years ago, when I was still wearing a Texas Ranger badge, we spent 8 months tracking Sullivan's operation across 3 territories. He was running what amounted to a slavery network, capturing women and children from isolated settlements and ranches, then selling them to mine owners and brothel keepers down in Mexico. Elena absorbed this information with the stoic acceptance of someone who'd learned early and painfully that the world contained genuine monsters wearing human faces. "How many people?" "We rescued 23 souls from his main camp when we finally caught up with them," Jacob replied, checking the action on his Winchester rifle with practiced efficiency. "But that was just one facility. Intelligence suggested he'd been operating for at least 3 years before we got wind of him. Conservative estimates put his victim count somewhere north of 200 people." Tommy looked up from where he was methodically organizing cartridges by caliber, his young face grave with understanding. "What happened to the other Rangers who were with you?" Jacob's weathered face hardened like granite, the lines around his eyes deepening as painful memories surfaced. Dead, every last one of them. Sullivan kept his word about hunting down everyone who had cost him his business. Captain Henderson was shot in the back outside a saloon in Amarillo, never saw it coming. Sergeant Williams they found floating face down in the Rio Grande with his throat cut ear to ear. Corporal Jackson simply vanished one night on patrol, and we never found so much as a button from his uniform. The litany of death hung heavy in the cabin's warm air, like smoke from a funeral pyre. Elena felt a chill that had absolutely nothing to do with the Montana winter seeping through the log walls. "So he's here primarily for revenge against you," she said, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was learning. "Partly," Jacob replied grimly, his eyes never leaving the window where he could track the subtle movements of men positioning themselves for assault. "But Sullivan's a businessman first and foremost. Revenge is just seasoning on the main course. You represent valuable merchandise to him, probably worth $1,000 or more to the right buyers. And I've interfered with what he considers a legitimate business transaction." Outside, Sullivan's voice cut through the wind again like a blade through silk. "Mitchell, I know you can hear me. Let me tell you exactly what's going to happen to your little makeshift family if you don't cooperate with me." The word family struck all three occupants of the cabin like a physical blow. In the space of barely 24 hours, they'd gone from complete strangers to something that genuinely resembled a family unit, bound together by shared danger and mutual dependence. Jacob made a decision that would have seemed impossible to him just yesterday morning. "Tommy, Elena, listen to me carefully. What I'm about to tell you goes against everything the United States Army taught me about protecting civilians and non-combatants." He turned away from the window to face them both directly, his expression carrying the gravity of a commanding officer preparing his troops for desperate action. "I'm going to teach you both how to fight effectively, because Sullivan won't be satisfied with simply killing me. He'll take you both alive if he possibly can, and I promise you that would be infinitely worse than a clean death." The next hour passed in intensive combat training unlike anything either Elena or Tommy had ever experienced. Jacob showed Elena how to properly hold and aim the Colt revolver with a two-handed grip, how to control her breathing and squeeze the trigger smoothly rather than jerking it and throwing off her aim. Tommy already knew the basic fundamentals of marksmanship from their time together, but Jacob refined his technique and explained tactical positioning for defensive combat. "The most important principle to remember," Jacob emphasized repeatedly, "is that we function as a coordinated unit. Elena, your responsibility is covering the back window and the approach from the creek. Tommy, you watch our left flank where the trees come closest to the cabin. I'll handle the front approach and coordinate our overall response to whatever they throw at us." But their intensive preparations were suddenly interrupted by a new development that changed the tactical situation completely. A single rider approached the cabin slowly, conspicuously carrying a white flag fashioned from what appeared to be a torn shirt tied to the barrel of his rifle. One of Sullivan's men, a thin, weaselly individual with nervous, darting eyes and hands that shook from either bitter cold or barely controlled fear. "Message from Mr. Sullivan," the man called out when he reached a position within comfortable shouting distance of the cabin. Jacob cracked open the heavy wooden door just wide enough to aim his rifle through the gap. "State your business and make it quick." "Mr. Sullivan wants me to tell you he's got the Jensen family," the messenger announced, his voice carrying clearly across the snow-covered clearing. "That's Magnus Jensen, his wife Astrid, and their 3 little children. Pretty little things, ages 8, 6, and 4 years old. Mr. Sullivan says if you don't surrender the woman within the next 60 minutes, he'll start killing them one at a time, beginning with the youngest child." The words hit Jacob like a physical blow to his midsection, driving the air from his lungs. He knew the Jensen family intimately. Hard-working Swedish immigrants who'd homesteaded a modest farm approximately 5 miles from Frost Ridge. Magnus was a skilled blacksmith whose services were valued throughout the territory. Astrid was universally beloved for her kindness and generosity to anyone in need, and their 3 children were exactly the kind of bright, innocent souls that made the harsh realities of frontier life bearable for everyone who knew them. "He's lying," Elena said, though her voice carried a note of uncertainty that betrayed her hope rather than her conviction. "No," Jacob replied with grim certainty, his knowledge of Sullivan's methods leaving no room for doubt. "He's not lying. This is precisely the kind of psychological leverage Sullivan specializes in using. Innocent people become his weapons against anyone who opposes him. Tommy's face had gone pale as fresh snow. We have to save them, Pa. We can't let him hurt children. Jacob stared out at the nervous messenger, his tactical mind racing through possibilities and probabilities with the speed of long experience. If he surrendered Elena as demanded, Sullivan would certainly kill all of them anyway, simply to eliminate witnesses and tie up loose ends. If he refused outright, 3 innocent children would die horrible deaths because of his stubbornness and their proximity to his conflict. Tell Sullivan he has his deal, Jacob called out to the messenger, his voice betraying none of his inner turmoil. 1 hour to arrange the details of the exchange. After the messenger had spurred his horse back toward the tree line where Sullivan's main force waited, Jacob turned to face Elena and Tommy's shocked, questioning expressions. "You're not actually planning to hand me over to that monster," Elena said. The words weren't quite phrased as a question, but the uncertainty in her voice was unmistakable. "Absolutely not," Jacob replied firmly, "but I am going to use Sullivan's expectations and overconfidence against him in ways he won't anticipate." Jacob began sketching a rough tactical map of the surrounding area on the cabin's wooden table, using charcoal from the fireplace. "Elena, you mentioned that Dr. Chen has been watching over you for years, monitoring your situation. Where exactly would we find her at this time of day?" "She maintains a medical clinic behind the general store, but I don't understand why that matters now. Because if she had been tracking your situation and Cyrus Harper's activities for 8 years as you described, she might possess information we desperately need about Sullivan's operation. More importantly, she might be able to help us determine where Sullivan is holding the Jensen family and any other hostages." Jacob's plan was audacious in its apparent simplicity, relying on misdirection and Sullivan's assumptions about their desperation. "We're going to divide our forces. Elena, you'll approach Sullivan's position as if you're surrendering yourself as agreed, but you'll be wearing Tommy's oversized coat and hat pulled low. From any significant distance, especially in this weather, you'll appear to be a young boy rather than a woman." "That's completely insane," Elena protested, though Jacob could hear the thoughtful consideration underlying her objection. "What if something goes wrong? What if they realize the deception before you can act?" "Then we improvise and adapt as circumstances require," Jacob replied with the matter-of-fact tone of a man who'd survived 15 years of frontier combat. "But if we take no action at all, the Jensen family dies, and we'll find ourselves right back where we started. Except Sullivan will have demonstrated conclusively that he can control our actions through threats against innocent people." The plan required precise timing and coordination. Elena would leave the cabin exactly 40 minutes after the messenger's departure, giving Jacob and Tommy sufficient time to reach their flanking positions without being observed. The key element was ensuring that Sullivan's attention remained focused entirely on the approaching figure, allowing the other two to maneuver undetected through the forest. But as they prepared to execute this desperate gambit, Elena revealed information that fundamentally changed their understanding of the entire situation. "Jacob," she said quietly, her voice carrying a weight that immediately commanded his full attention, "there's something crucially important about Dr. Chen that I should have told you yesterday. Something I didn't fully understand myself until now." Jacob paused in his final weapons check, sensing from her tone that this revelation would be significant. "What exactly?" 8 years ago, when my parents died from what everyone assumed was fever, Dr. Chen was the one who examined their bodies before burial. At the time, I thought she was simply performing her duties as the town's only medical practitioner. But looking back now, with everything we've learned— "Now what?" Jacob prompted, his attention entirely focused on her words. Elena took a deep, steadying breath. "I remember her asking Cyrus very specific, detailed questions about what my parents had eaten in their final days, who had visited them during the week before their deaths, what their recent business dealings had involved. She made extensive notes in a small leather journal, writing down everything with meticulous care." Jacob felt ice forming in his stomach as the implications became clear. "What kind of specific questions?" "About recent visitors, about whether they'd had any unusual business dealings or financial transactions, about their physical symptoms and the progression of their illness. And most significantly, she collected and preserved samples." "Samples of what, exactly?" "Hair clippings, fragments of their clothing, even small amounts of the food they'd eaten before becoming ill. She told Cyrus it was for medical research to better understand the disease and prevent it from spreading to other families. But now, Elena's voice trailed off as the full implications of what she was describing became crystal clear to all three of them. Jacob stared at her with growing understanding. "You believe your parents were murdered. I think Dr. Chen suspected they were murdered from the very beginning," Elena replied, her voice gaining strength as the pieces fell into place. "And I think she's been systematically gathering evidence to prove it ever since." The revelation completely reframed everything they thought they understood about their situation. If Elena's parents had indeed been murdered for their valuable land holdings, if Cyrus Harper had been part of a carefully orchestrated conspiracy that included Marcus Sullivan, then the events of the past day weren't random at all. They were the culmination of a plan that had been 8 years in the making. "We need to locate Dr. Chen immediately," Jacob declared. "She may hold the answers to all of this." But their urgent conference was abruptly interrupted by the distinctive sound of sustained gunfire emanating from the direction of Frost Ridge. Not the random celebratory shots that sometimes echoed from frontier settlements, but the organized, disciplined volleys of multiple men engaged in serious, coordinated combat. Jacob moved quickly to the window and retrieved his military field glasses, focusing them on the town below. Through the swirling snow, he could clearly make out smoke rising from several buildings, muzzle flashes winking like deadly fireflies, and the purposeful movement of armed figures between structures. "Sullivan's not limiting himself to our personal conflict," Jacob realized with growing alarm. "He's seizing control of the entire town." The tactical situation had just become infinitely more complex and dangerous. Sullivan wasn't planning a simple prisoner exchange or even a straightforward revenge killing. He was establishing complete control over the entire area, effectively turning Frost Ridge into his personal kingdom and source of unlimited leverage. "But why would he want control of the whole town?" Tommy asked, his 12-year-old mind struggling to grasp the scope of Sullivan's ambitions. "Complete control means unlimited hostages and unlimited leverage," Jacob explained grimly. "If he holds the town and everyone in it, he can make demands that no one can refuse. It's a strategy he's probably used before in other locations." Elena moved to look over his shoulder through the field glasses. "Which means the Jensen family isn't his only source of leverage against us." Jacob lowered the glasses, his experienced military mind working furiously to process this new intelligence. "We're not dealing with a simple revenge scenario anymore. This is a full-scale invasion and occupation." The sound of rapidly approaching horses drew their attention back to the immediate tactical situation. 3 riders were moving up the trail toward the cabin at considerable speed, no longer under any pretense of negotiation, but with weapons drawn and ready for immediate use. "Looks like the diplomatic phase of this engagement has officially concluded," Jacob observed with a grim humor, taking his position at the window with his rifle at the ready. The lead rider was unmistakably Sullivan himself, his massive frame and distinctive silhouette recognizable even at distance through the falling snow. The 2 men flanking him had the lean, predatory look of professional gunfighters, the kind of skilled killers who gathered around successful outlaw leaders like carrion birds around a fresh carcass. "Iron Horse," Sullivan bellowed when he reached a position within comfortable voice range of the cabin. "Time's up. Send out the woman now, or start counting dead children." Jacob made his choice in that instant. Instead of responding with words that would only provide Sullivan with additional intelligence about their situation, he answered with his Winchester rifle, sending a carefully aimed .44-40 round that splintered the tree trunk mere inches from Sullivan's head. The message was unmistakably clear. No surrender, no negotiation, no compromise. Sullivan's response was immediate, professional, and devastating. All 3 riders spurred their horses into practiced, evasive maneuvers while returning disciplined fire. Within seconds, bullets began slamming into the cabin's thick log walls with sounds like giant hammers, sending deadly splinters flying through the interior and filling the air with the acrid smell of gunpowder and the sharp crack of rifles being fired in rapid succession. "Elena! Tommy! Get down and stay down!" Jacob shouted over the increasing din of combat, working the lever action of his rifle as rapidly as his experienced hands could manage. "Keep away from the windows and watch for movement on our flanks." The sustained gunfight that followed was unlike anything Elena had ever experienced in her 21 years of life. The noise was absolutely overwhelming. The sharp crack of rifles, the angry whistle of bullets passing close enough to touch, the splintering of wood as rounds found their mark, and the constant shouting of men trying to coordinate their movements and tactics over the sounds of combat. The small cabin filled rapidly with choking smoke from both their own weapons and the powder smoke drifting in through gaps and bullet holes in the walls. Jacob fought with the cool, methodical precision of a 15-year veteran, picking his shots with careful deliberation and making every precious round count toward maximum effect. Tommy proved surprisingly effective with a smaller rifle that Jacob had modified for his size, his young eyes sharp enough to spot targets and movement that Jacob's more experienced but aging vision might have missed in the swirling snow. But Elena surprised them both completely. After the initial shock of being under concentrated fire began to wear off, she settled into a steady, workmanlike rhythm of loading, aiming, and firing that spoke of remarkable natural aptitude for combat. More importantly, she showed absolutely no signs of panic or breakdown, following Jacob's tactical instructions with precision and maintaining disciplined observation of her assigned sector, even under the most intense pressure. The fierce exchange of gunfire continued for the better part of 20 minutes, before Sullivan apparently decided that a direct frontal assault wasn't worth the casualties his men were taking. His surviving riders withdrew to positions just outside the effective range of accurate rifle fire, maintaining the siege but avoiding further immediate losses to their limited manpower. "What's his next move likely to be?" Elena asked during the temporary lull in combat, reloading her revolver with hands that remained remarkably steady. Jacob was methodically checking his ammunition supply, his movements automatic after years of similar situations. "He's reassessing the situation and considering alternatives. Sullivan's too experienced and too intelligent to waste men on futile frontal assaults when he doesn't have to. He'll try something more subtle and more effective." As if summoned by Jacob's tactical prediction, a new voice called out from the concealment of the tree line. Not Sullivan's harsh baritone this time, but someone else entirely speaking in higher-pitched, almost childlike tones that nonetheless clearly belonged to an adult. "Miss Harper! Miss Elena Harper! Can you hear me?" The voice carried an odd, sing-song quality that made the hair on the back of Jacob's neck stand on end. "I have someone very special here who desperately wants to speak with you." Jacob risked a careful look through the window and saw a slight figure being roughly pushed forward into the clearing. Even at considerable distance and through the heavy snowfall, he could recognize the distinctive frame and clothing of Dr. Sarah Chen, the Chinese physician who had been Elena's secret protector. "Elena!" Dr. Chen's voice carried clearly across the white expanse, though it was obviously weakened by whatever treatment she'd received at Sullivan's hands. "They have the Jensen family, and others. Everyone who tried to help you over the years. Everyone who showed you any kindness." Sullivan's cruel, triumphant laughter echoed through the forest like the howling of wolves. "Your little Chinese friend has been remarkably helpful to our cause. She's provided us with extensive details about her 8-year investigation into your parents' suspicious deaths. Very thorough and very professionally documented." Jacob felt all the pieces of the puzzle clicking into place with horrible clarity. Dr. Chen hadn't betrayed them voluntarily. She'd been captured while attempting to help Elena, and Sullivan had extracted the crucial information through interrogation techniques that Jacob preferred not to contemplate. "She also provided us with detailed information about all the evidence she's been systematically collecting," Sullivan continued with obvious satisfaction. "Letters, preserved tissue samples, witness statements, financial records. Quite the little prosecutor, your Chen. Unfortunately for her professional future, she's outlived her usefulness to our operation." The sound of a single gunshot cracked across the clearing like a breaking bone. Chen's slight figure crumpled into the blood-stained snow. Her life ended with the casual brutality that marks Sullivan's approach to human obstacles. Elena screamed, a sound of pure rage and devastating loss that seemed to shake the cabin's thick walls and echo off the surrounding mountains. She started toward the door with obvious intent to charge into the clearing, but Jacob caught her arm in an iron grip. "Elena, no, that's exactly what he wants. He's deliberately trying to provoke us into doing something tactically stupid. She was trying to help me, Elena sobbed, fighting against Jacob's restraining hand. For 8 years, she was the only person in this entire territory who cared what happened to me. And her sacrifice won't mean anything if we get ourselves killed in a futile gesture, Jacob said firmly but gently. We honor her memory and her courage by surviving this encounter, by making sure Sullivan pays the full price for what he's done to innocent people. Tommy, meanwhile, had maintained his disciplined watch and now called out urgently, "Pa! There's significant movement on our left flank. Looks like at least 2 men trying to work around behind us." Jacob moved quickly to confirm Tommy's observation. Sure enough, 2 of Sullivan's remaining men were systematically working their way around the cabin's defensive perimeter, using the heavy snowfall and scattered boulders as concealment for their flanking maneuver. They're going to attempt a coordinated attack from multiple directions, Jacob realized aloud. Once they have us effectively surrounded, they can maintain fire from several positions simultaneously while advancing under covering fire. The tactical situation was deteriorating with alarming speed. They were significantly outnumbered, outgunned by men with superior training, and now faced the immediate prospect of being completely surrounded. Worse, Sullivan had demonstrated beyond any doubt his absolute willingness to murder innocent people to achieve his objectives. But Elena had undergone a fundamental transformation during the past few minutes of violence and revelation. The overwhelming grief and white-hot rage over Dr. Chen's brutal murder had burned away the last vestiges of the frightened, submissive woman who'd been sold like livestock just 24 hours earlier. In her place stood someone infinitely harder, more determined, and considerably more dangerous to her enemies. "Tell me exactly what we need to do," she said, her voice steady as granite, despite the tears still glistening on her cheeks. Jacob looked at her with genuine respect and growing admiration. "We need to break out of this encirclement before they can complete it and trap us completely. But I won't lie to you, it's going to be extremely dangerous for all of us." He began outlining a plan that represented equal parts calculated desperation and pure audacity. "Tommy, you're the fastest runner and the smallest target among us. You're going to slip out through the pied window and work your way carefully around to where they've left their horses. Elena and I will create maximum distraction from the front to cover your movement." "What kind of distraction are you planning?" Elena asked, though her tone suggested she already suspected the answer. Jacob's smile was as cold and implacable as the Montana wind howling outside their walls. The kind that puts Sullivan on notice that he's not dealing with helpless victims anymore. 20 minutes later, Elena Harper did something that would have been utterly unthinkable to her just 24 hours earlier. She kicked open the cabin's heavy door with tremendous force and stepped deliberately out into the active gunfire, a loaded Colt revolver gripped firmly in each hand. "Sullivan!" she shouted, her voice carrying clearly across the clearing with unmistakable authority and challenge. "You want me so badly? Then stop hiding behind trees like a coward and come take me." Her sudden, aggressive appearance caught Sullivan's men completely off guard. They'd been anticipating either abject surrender or continued passive resistance from what they considered helpless prey, not a direct armed challenge from the woman they'd been told was a broken victim. Elena began walking steadily toward the tree line where she knew Sullivan waited, firing both weapons as she advanced through the deepening snow. Her accuracy wasn't particularly impressive, but precision wasn't the tactical objective. The point was to draw every enemy eye to her position, to make Sullivan's remaining men focus entirely on her instead of watching for other threats moving through their perimeter. Behind her, Jacob emerged from the cabin carrying his Winchester rifle, adding his considerably more accurate fire to Elena's suppressing volleys. Together, they created enough noise, confusion, and immediate threat to completely mask Tommy's stealthy movement through the trees toward the enemy's horses. The boy moved like a young ghost, utilizing every technique Jacob had taught him about stealth and wilderness craft during their year together. Within minutes, he'd successfully reached the area where Sullivan's men had left their horses, systematically cutting the valuable animals loose and sending them scattering in panic into the forest. The sudden loss of their mounts changed the tactical situation immediately and dramatically. Sullivan's men were now stranded afoot in increasingly hostile terrain during an active blizzard. their mobility severely compromised, and their escape options effectively eliminated. But the most significant change was occurring within Elena herself. As she continued advancing through the knee-deep snow, firing at targets she could barely distinguish through the swirling white, she felt something profound awakening deep inside her spirit. Not merely courage, though courage was certainly part of the transformation. Something deeper and more fundamental. The absolute recognition that she possessed the inherent right to fight for her own life and the lives of those she'd chosen to protect. For 8 long years, she'd passively accepted systematic beatings because she'd been taught through repetition and brutality that she deserved such treatment. She'd endured calculated humiliation because she'd believed, with the certainty of learned helplessness, that resistance was not only futile, but would result in even worse punishment. But watching Dr. Chen die, witnessing the casual cruelty with which Sullivan treated human life as disposable property, something fundamental inside her had finally broken free of its chains. She wasn't a victim anymore. She was a woman with weapons who'd finally learned not just how to use them, but why she had the right to do so. The sustained firefight continued until the brief winter day began fading into the purple dusk that came early to mountain valleys. Sullivan's surviving men, now without horses and facing opponents who'd proven far more resourceful and dangerous than anyone had anticipated, began withdrawing toward the town in what wasn't quite a retreat, but was definitely a tactical repositioning for whatever phase of the conflict would come next. As darkness settled over the battlefield like a heavy blanket, Jacob, Elena, and Tommy found themselves in possession of the immediate area, but facing an uncertain and dangerous future. Sullivan still controlled the town and its inhabitants, still held innocent hostages, including the Jensen family, and still commanded superior numbers of experienced fighters. But they'd proven something crucially important, both to themselves and to their enemies. They could fight effectively as a coordinated unit. More than that, they could win tactical engagements against professional opponents when properly motivated and led. "What happens now?" Elena asked, as they took shelter once again in the bullet-scarred cabin that had become their fortress. Jacob looked at her, seeing not the frightened woman he'd rescued, but the accomplished warrior she'd revealed herself to be under pressure. "Now we take the fight to them. Now we go get our people back." Outside, the snow continued falling steadily, covering the evidence of violence and preparing the stage for whatever battles lay ahead in their struggle. In the distance, smoke continued rising from Frost Ridge, a stark reminder that their fight was far from over and that innocent lives hung in the balance. But inside the cabin, 3 people who'd found each other under the darkest possible circumstances began planning their next moves with the confidence of those who'd discovered their own strength. They'd learned that sometimes the strongest families weren't born from blood relationships, but forged in the crucible of shared danger, and that love wasn't merely a comfortable feeling, but an active commitment to stand together against whatever darkness threatened those they'd chosen to protect. The war for Elena Harper's freedom and the safety of Frost Ridge's innocent people had only begun in earnest, but for the first time in 8 years, Elena was fighting back with everything she possessed. And that fundamental change made all the difference in a world where strength was the only currency that mattered. The storm had finally broken by dawn, leaving behind a world transformed into crystalline perfection that seemed to mock the violence of the previous day. Snow lay 3 feet deep across the Montana landscape, turning familiar terrain into something alien and beautiful. But beneath the pristine surface, death lingered like a poison in the mountain air. Dressera Chen's body lay frozen in the clearing where Sullivan's bullet had claimed her life, a stark reminder that beauty and brutality often walked hand in hand on the frontier. Jacob Mitchell stood at the cabin window, his weathered hands gripping a cup of coffee that had long since grown cold. At 30 years old, he carried himself with the bearing of a man who'd seen too much death. But the events of the past 2 days had awakened something in him that he'd thought buried with Rose and Danny 3 years earlier. Purpose, a reason to fight beyond mere survival, a future worth building instead of simply enduring. Elena Harper moved quietly around the cabin, checking their weapons and ammunition with the methodical precision of someone who'd learned combat necessity through bitter experience. The transformation in her was remarkable to witness. 48 hours ago, she'd been a broken woman sold like livestock for 2 mules and 5 horses. Now she moved with the controlled grace of a warrior who'd discovered her own strength and refused to surrender it again. Tommy Bennett, despite his 12 years, had proven himself worthy of the trust Jacob had placed in him. The boy sat at the rough wooden table, carefully cleaning the rifles with the attention to detail that Jacob had drilled into him during their year together. His young face bore an expression of grim determination that belonged on someone 3 times his age. But the frontier had a way of aging children quickly. "They'll come for us again," Elena said, stating the obvious truth that all 3 of them understood with crystal clarity. "Sullivan won't let yesterday's defeat stand without response." Jacob nodded grimly, his tactical mind already working through possibilities and countermeasures. "He's had all night to regroup and plan his next move, and he still holds the entire town hostage, which gives him unlimited leverage." The tactical situation remained desperate despite their victory in the previous day's firefight. Sullivan commanded superior numbers, controlled all the strategic positions in Frost Ridge, and possessed unlimited leverage through his civilian hostages. Worse, the winter storm had effectively cut them off from any hope of outside assistance. They were alone against an enemy who'd built his reputation on never leaving witnesses alive. But as Jacob studied the frozen landscape through the bullet-scarred window, his military mind began working through possibilities that others might have missed. Sullivan's greatest strength, his control over the entire settlement, might also prove to be his greatest weakness. By seizing the whole town, he'd committed his forces to holding a large, complex position with multiple approaches and countless hiding places where a small, determined force could operate effectively. "Elena," he said, turning from the window with the decisive air of a commander who'd reached a crucial decision, "tell me everything you know about the wayside of Frost Ridge. Every building, every back alley, every place someone might hide or take cover." She looked at him with growing understanding, recognizing the shift in his demeanor from defensive to offensive thinking. "You're planning to take the fight to them." "We're planning to take the fight to them," Jacob corrected with emphasis. "All 3 of us. Together, as a family." Tommy's head snapped up from his rifle cleaning, his young eyes bright with excitement and determination. "You mean we're going to attack Sullivan's positions directly?" "I mean we're going to rescue the hostages and end this once and for all," Jacob replied, with quiet certainty that carried absolute conviction. "Sullivan expects us to either surrender out of desperation or attempt to flee the territory. He won't be prepared for a direct assault on his positions by a force he considers negligible." Elena studied Jacob's face, recognizing the cold calculation that marked men who'd learned warfare through bitter necessity rather than academic study. "What exactly are you proposing?" Jacob moved to the table and began sketching a detailed tactical map of Frost Ridge with charcoal from the fireplace, his movements sure and precise. "Sullivan's men are spread thin, trying to control the entire settlement simultaneously. They can't be everywhere at once, and they can't watch every approach with equal attention." He marked key positions on his impromptu map with careful precision. The jail where they're probably holding the Jensen family and other high-value hostages, the saloon where Sullivan's likely established his command headquarters, the church where most of the townspeople would be kept under guard. Each position requires manpower, which means his forces are divided. "That's still a lot of ground to cover with just 3 people, Elena observed, though her tone suggested she was analyzing rather than objecting. "Which is exactly why it might work," Jacob replied with the confidence of someone who'd made similar calculations under fire. "They'll expect a larger force if they expect an attack at all. 3 people can move quietly through familiar terrain, strike fast at vulnerable points, and disappear before they can organize an effective response." But their intensive planning was suddenly interrupted by an unexpected sound that changed everything. Horses approaching the cabin at considerable speed through the deep snow. Jacob grabbed his rifle and moved to the window, expecting to see Sullivan's men returning for another assault attempt. Instead, he saw something that made him blink in amazement and doubt his own vision. A small Chinese woman in her 50s, riding through the snow with the accomplished skill of someone who'd spent her entire life in the saddle. Behind her rode 2 men Jacob didn't recognize, both well-armed and maintaining alert, professional postures that suggested military or law enforcement backgrounds. "Chen?" Elena gasped, pressing close to the window to see the approaching figures more clearly. "No," Jacob said grimly, his rational mind rejecting what his eyes were showing him. Dr. Chen is dead. We watched Sullivan shoot her down in cold blood yesterday. The woman dismounted with fluid grace and approached the cabin with her hands clearly visible and empty of weapons. When she was close enough to be heard clearly over the wind, she called out in accented but perfectly clear English that carried absolute authority. "My name is Dr. Sarah Chen," she announced without preamble. "I believe you think I am dead." Jacob kept his rifle trained on her through the partially opened door, his finger ready on the trigger. "If you're Dr. Chen, then who exactly did we see Sullivan murder yesterday?" "My younger sister, Dr. Linda Chen," the woman replied, her voice carrying profound grief that couldn't be fabricated. "She was visiting my clinic when Sullivan's men came to capture me. She tried to protect my patients and my medical records. They killed her thinking she was me." Elena pushed past Jacob to get a better look at the woman's face. The resemblance was unmistakable when examined closely, though this woman was clearly older and carried herself with an authority that spoke of someone accustomed to command and respect. "The evidence, Atish," Elena said urgent, her voice tight with desperate hope. "The records about my parents' deaths that you've been collecting. Do you still have them?" Chen smiled grimly, her expression carrying the satisfaction of someone who'd planned carefully for this exact moment. "I have something far better than records, my dear. I have living witnesses who saw Marcus Sullivan and Cyrus Harper murder your parents 8 years ago." She gestured to the two men who'd accompanied her, both of whom looked weathered by years of frontier life, but possessed the steady eyes of men who'd seen violence and weren't intimidated by it. "Meet Frank Morrison and Jim Bradley. 8 years ago, they were working for your father, helping him prepare a comprehensive land survey for the territorial government. They witnessed everything. Frank Morrison, a weathered man in his 40s with the calloused hands of someone who worked with surveying equipment, stepped forward with obvious respect. "Miss Harper, we've been waiting 8 years for the chance to tell what we know. Your parents discovered that Marcus Sullivan was running an elaborate land grab scheme, using forged documents and intimidation to claim homesteads after murdering the legal owners. Your father was about to report Sullivan's entire operation to the federal authorities in Helena," Jim Bradley added, his voice carrying the weight of suppressed guilt. "That's why they had to kill him. And your mother knew too much about the financial irregularities to be allowed to live." The revelation hit Elena like a physical blow to her chest, driving the air from her lungs. Her parents hadn't died from some random disease, as she'd been told. They'd been deliberately murdered for trying to stop a criminal conspiracy that had probably claimed dozens of other innocent lives across the territory. "There's more," Dr. Chen said, her tone becoming brisk and businesslike. "Judge William Harrison is already en route from Helena with a full company of federal marshals. My sister managed to get word out before Sullivan's men found her hiding place. Help is coming, but it won't arrive for another 2 full days." Jacob felt the tactical situation shifting dramatically, new possibilities opening up like flowers in spring rain. "Sullivan doesn't know about the marshals?" "Not unless he's managed to capture and interrogate the messenger I sent," Dr. Chen replied with satisfaction. "But he does know that time is running short for his operation. According to our intelligence, he's planning to kill all the hostages and abandon the territory sometime tonight." The urgency of their situation had just increased exponentially. They no longer had the luxury of careful planning or waiting for optimal conditions. If they were going to save the innocent people of Frost Ridge, they had to act immediately and decisively. "Dr. Chen," Jacob said, his voice carrying the authority of command, "what can you tell us about Sullivan's current tactical positions throughout the town?" "Quite a lot," she replied with obvious satisfaction. "Frank and Jim have been conducting surveillance from concealed positions in the hills since yesterday evening. We know exactly where the hostages are being held and how many guards Sullivan has posted at each location." Frank Morrison spread out a detailed map of Frost Ridge drawn on prepared leather, marking positions with careful precision. "Main group of townspeople is being held in the church basement under heavy guard. Maybe 25 people total, including women and children. 2 sentries posted at the main entrance, 1 additional guard at the back door. The Jensen family and other high-value hostages are secured in the jail building," Jim Bradley continued, pointing to the specific locations on the map. "That's the most heavily defended position. Minimum of 4 men on duty, possibly more stationed inside the building itself. Sullivan himself has established his command post in the saloon with his remaining core group, Dr. Chen added with the precision of someone who'd spent years gathering intelligence. Our count shows 6 to 7 men total. They've been drinking heavily since yesterday, celebrating what they believe is their inevitable victory. Jacob studied the map intently, his tactical mind working through approaches, timing, and resource allocation. How many men does Sullivan have left in his entire force? We count no more than 12 or 13 effective fighters, Frank replied. Your actions yesterday eliminated a significant portion of his original strength. But the survivors are all experienced killers, and they know that capture means hanging. Elena had been listening intently to every word of the intelligence briefing. Now she spoke with the quiet authority of someone who'd discovered her own strength and refused to be denied. I want to be the one who faces Sullivan directly when the time comes. Absolutely not, Jacob said immediately, his protective instincts overriding tactical considerations. It's far too dangerous for you to engage him personally. It's my right, Elena replied with firm conviction that brooked no argument. He murdered my parents for trying to do the right thing. He's terrorized this entire community for years. And he's the one who killed Dr. Chen's sister while trying to get to me. This is my fight, and I won't be denied the chance to finish it. Dr. Chen looked at Elena with obvious respect and approval. The young woman is correct in her assessment. Sometimes justice must be personal to be truly complete and meaningful. Tommy had been following the conversation with the intense focus of someone far older than his 12 years. What about me? What's my specific role in this operation? Jacob looked at the boy who'd become like a son to him, recognizing the same stubborn courage that had led him to ride through a blizzard to warn them about Sullivan's initial approach. Your assignment is the most critical of all, Tommy. You're going to be responsible for getting the civilian hostages to safety while Elena and I deal with Sullivan's armed men. I can fight just as well as anyone, Tommy protested, with the indignation of youth being told to step aside. I proved that yesterday during the siege. And you'll fight if circumstances require it, Jacob agreed. But protecting innocent people is just as important as eliminating threats, maybe more important in the long run. They spent the next 2 hours refining their plan with the detailed intelligence provided by Dr. Chen and her companions. The assault would be carefully coordinated to begin simultaneously at 3 critical locations: the church where most civilians were held, the jail containing high-value hostages, and the saloon serving as Sullivan's headquarters. Dr. Chen would lead a diversionary attack on Sullivan's outer perimeter guards, while Jacob's team struck at the primary objectives. The timing would be crucial. They needed to move fast enough to prevent Sullivan from executing hostages, but carefully enough to avoid unnecessary casualties among the townspeople. But as they prepared to depart for what would likely be the final confrontation, Elena made a request that surprised everyone present. Before we begin the operation, she said quietly, I want to visit my parents' graves. Dr. Chen nodded with immediate understanding. They're buried in the cemetery behind the church, not far from where we'll be operating. But Elena, you should know something important. They're not resting in unmarked graves, as Cyrus Harper told everyone. I've been maintaining their burial site for 8 years, waiting for the day when justice would finally be done. The small group made their way carefully through the snow-covered forest toward Frost Ridge, moving with the stealth that came naturally to people who'd learned to survive in hostile territory. The town lay silent under its pristine blanket of white, smoke rising from chimneys in deceptively peaceful columns that belied the violence simmering beneath the surface. Elena stood before 2 modest but dignified headstones that Dr. Chen had commissioned and maintained at her own expense. The inscriptions were simple but powerful. Robert Harper, beloved husband and father, 1838 to 1873, and Mary Harper, beloved wife and mother, 1842-1873. Below each name were the dates of their birth and death in a single powerful line that told the truth: murdered for their integrity. I'm going to make this right, Elena whispered to the stones, her breath forming clouds in the frigid air. I'm going to make sure everyone knows what really happened to you both. Your deaths won't be meaningless. Jacob placed a gentle, supportive hand on her shoulder. They would be incredibly proud of the woman you have become, Elena, proud of your strength and your courage. I hope so, Elena replied, her voice thick with emotion. I hope they'd understand why I have to do what comes next. The church basement, where most of the townspeople were being held, proved to be less heavily guarded than their intelligence had suggested. The 2 sentries posted at the main entrance had grown dangerously complacent during their long, boring watch, and Frank Morrison was able to eliminate both silently with a knife before they could raise any kind of alarm. Tommy proved his exceptional value immediately by taking charge of the terrified hostages with remarkable efficiency and maturity. Follow me single file and maintain absolute silence, he whispered to the group of families huddled in the coal basement. We're going to get all of you out of here safely, but you must do exactly as I say. Meanwhile, Jacob approached the jail building from the rear, using skills learned during years of hunting dangerous men through hostile territory. The structure was more heavily defended than the church, but its guards were focused primarily on preventing escape from within rather than watching for external assault from unexpected directions. The coordinated attack began with Elena walking boldly up Frost Ridge's main street toward the saloon where Sullivan maintained his headquarters. She'd abandoned any attempt at concealment or stealth, instead choosing to announce her presence with unmistakable clarity and defiant courage. Marcus Sullivan, she called out when she was still 50 yards from the building, her voice carrying clearly through the crisp air. I know you're hiding in there like the coward you are. Time to finish what you started 8 years ago when you murdered my parents. The saloon's bat-wing doors burst open violently, and Sullivan himself emerged, flanked by 4 of his remaining men, all armed and ready for violence. In the bright afternoon sunlight reflecting off the snow, Elena could see him clearly for the first time since childhood, a massive figure wrapped in a buffalo coat with pale eyes that held no more warmth than chips of glacial ice. Well, well, Sullivan said, his voice carrying easily across the snow-covered street. The little mouse has finally decided to roar like a lion. How absolutely touching and pathetic. You murdered my parents in cold blood, Elena said, continuing her steady, fearless approach. Robert and Mary Harper. You killed them because they discovered your land fraud scheme, and you've been profiting from their deaths ever since. Sullivan's laugh was genuinely amused, as if she'd told him a particularly entertaining joke. Guilty as charged, little girl. Though I prefer to think of it as efficient business practices. Your parents were foolishly standing in the way of economic progress. And Dr. Chen's sister yesterday, was murdering that innocent woman also efficient business? Merely collateral damage, Sullivan replied with an indifferent shrug that spoke volumes about his character. Sometimes innocent people get hurt when they interfere with important commercial enterprises. Elena had closed his distance to 30 yards, well within effective range for the Colt revolver she carried with practiced confidence. No more innocent people are going to die because of your greed and cruelty. Is that so? Sullivan's hand moved deliberately toward his own weapon, a matched pair of ivory-handled Colts that had ended many lives. And just how exactly do you plan to stop me, little girl? You're outnumbered 5-1 by experienced killers. Actually, Jacob's voice came from behind Sullivan's group, cold and implacable as winter stone. She's not outnumbered at all. Sullivan spun around in shock to find Jacob emerging from the jail building, having successfully neutralized all the guards stationed there. At the same precise moment, sustained gunfire erupted from multiple positions around the town as Dr. Chen's carefully planned diversionary attacks began drawing off Sullivan's remaining men from their assigned positions. The final confrontation that 8 years of injustice had been building toward took place in the middle of Frost Ridge's main street, with terrified witnesses watching from every window and doorway. Sullivan was remarkably fast with his weapons, faster than Elena had expected despite all her preparation. But months of intensive training under Jacob's expert guidance had prepared her specifically for this crucial moment. The gunfight itself lasted less than 30 seconds, but those seconds seemed to stretch into eternity as Elena faced down the man who'd destroyed her childhood and murdered her parents. When the acrid smoke finally cleared, Marcus Sullivan lay motionless in the blood-stained snow, his reign of terror finally ended by the woman whose life he'd tried to destroy. Elena stood over his corpse, breathing heavily but completely unharmed, smoke still rising from the barrels of her revolvers. That was for my parents, she said quietly but clearly enough for the watching townspeople to hear, and for Dr. Chen's sister, and for everyone else whose lives you destroyed with your greed. The aftermath of Sullivan's death was swift and decisive. His surviving men, completely demoralized by the sudden loss of their leader and finding themselves outnumbered by angry townspeople who'd finally armed themselves, either surrendered immediately or fled into the wilderness, where winter would likely claim them before they reached any form of civilization. Cyrus Harper was found cowering in his cabin like the coward he'd always been, and was immediately placed under arrest by the newly liberated Sheriff Bradley, who'd been held hostage in his own jail for 2 days. The man who'd sold his own niece into slavery would finally face justice for his crimes. Judge William Harrison arrived exactly 2 days later with a full company of federal marshals. What Elena didn't know until that moment was that Judge Harrison had been her father's closest friend and business partner 20 years earlier, before Robert Harper had moved to Montana. The judge had been searching for evidence against Sullivan for years, waiting for the right moment to strike. With the detailed testimony of Frank Morrison and Jim Bradley, Dr. Chen's meticulously preserved physical evidence, and the sworn statements of dozens of Sullivan's surviving victims, the full scope of the criminal conspiracy that had claimed Elena's parents was finally exposed to the light of justice. The courtroom in Helena was packed to capacity when Elena took the stand to testify about 8 years of systematic abuse and the murder of her parents. She spoke clearly and without tears, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd survived hell and emerged stronger for the experience. "I want everyone in this territory to understand," she said, addressing not just the judge and jury but the packed gallery of observers, "that my parents died because they tried to do the right thing. They died because they refused to be intimidated by evil men who thought power gave them the right to take whatever they wanted." Cyrus Harper was sentenced to life imprisonment in the Territorial Penitentiary at Deer Lodge, where he would spend his remaining years in the same kind of harsh conditions he'd imposed on Elena for 8 years. The fraudulent land claims that Sullivan had used to build his criminal empire were systematically overturned, and the stolen property was returned to the families of his victims or their surviving relatives. Elena found herself the legal owner of not just her parents' original homestead, but several additional parcels that her father had legitimately purchased before his death, but which had been stolen through forged documents. She was, quite suddenly, one of the wealthiest landowners in Montana Territory. But material wealth wasn't what mattered most to her as she stood in the parlor of Jacob's cabin 6 weeks after Sullivan's death, wearing the finest dress that money could buy, but feeling most beautiful because of the love surrounding her. What mattered was the family she'd found in the most unlikely circumstances, and the future they could build together based on truth rather than lies. "Elena Rose Harper," Jacob said, dropping to one knee before her, with a ring he'd crafted himself from the purest Montana silver he could obtain. "6 months ago, I offered you a marriage of convenience solely for legal protection. Today, I'm asking you to marry me because I love you with all my heart, because you've given me a reason to live instead of merely surviving, and because I cannot imagine any future without you as my partner in it." Elena looked at the beautifully crafted ring, then at Tommy, who was watching with bright, hopeful eyes from his position by the fireplace, then at the man who'd saved her life in every way that truly mattered. "Yes," she said simply, her voice carrying absolute certainty. "Yes to all of it. Yes to love, yes to family, yes to building something beautiful from the ashes of what we've lost." The wedding ceremony took place in the newly rebuilt Frost Ridge Church on a brilliantly clear February morning, when the entire world seemed to sparkle with crystalline possibility. Judge Harrison himself performed the ceremony, having made the journey from Helena specifically for this purpose. Dr. Chen served as Elena's matron of honor, while Tommy stood proudly as Jacob's best man. The entire population of Frost Ridge attended the ceremony, eager to celebrate the union of 3 people who'd risked everything to save them all from Sullivan's tyranny. Many of the guests bore scars, both visible and invisible, from their ordeal, but the atmosphere was one of pure joy and hope for the future. "Do you, Jacob Mitchell, take Elena Rose Harper to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, as long as you both shall live?" "I do," Jacob replied, his voice steady and sure, carrying 15 years of military discipline and 3 years of grief transformed into love. "Do you, Elena Rose Harper, take Jacob Mitchell to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, as long as you both shall live. I do, Elena said, her voice ringing with joy that seemed to fill every corner of the small church. Then by the power vested in me by the territory of Montana and the United States of America, I pronounce you husband and wife. Jacob, you may kiss your bride. The kiss that sealed their union was witnessed by friends and chosen family, but Elena felt as though the entire world had shifted into perfect alignment around this single moment. She was no longer alone, no longer powerless, no longer afraid. She was home in every sense that mattered. 5 years later, on a warm spring morning in 1887, Elena stood before the impressive wooden structure that had risen on her parents' former homestead. Above the entrance, carved letters spelled out Harper House in elegant script that could be read from considerable distance. It was the first shelter for abused women in Montana Territory, and it had already provided safety, education, and new beginnings for over 200 women and children from across the region. Elena, now 27 and visibly pregnant with her third child, watched with deep satisfaction as Tommy, now 17 and wearing the badge of the youngest deputy sheriff in territorial history, helped a new arrival carry her meager belongings into the building that represented hope incarnate. Jacob, now 35 and bearing the quiet confidence of a man who'd found his true purpose in life, approached on horseback with their two children securely seated before him. Hope Rose Mitchell, 3 years old and already displaying her mother's fearless spirit, and Daniel Robert Mitchell, barely 18 months old, but already showing unmistakable signs of his father's quiet strength and thoughtful nature. How many new arrivals this week? Jacob asked, dismounting to give Elena a gentle kiss that still made her heart race after 5 years of marriage. 7 women and 12 children, Elena replied with satisfaction. 3 families traveled all the way from Wyoming after hearing about what we do here. Word is spreading faster than we ever imagined possible. That's exactly what we hoped for, Jacob said with firm conviction. The more people who know there's a safe place to run to, the more lives we can save. Dr. Chen approached them, now in her early 60s but still energetic and completely dedicated to her expanding medical practice. The territorial governor has sent another letter, she announced with obvious pleasure. He wants to establish similar shelters in at least 6 other settlements and is asking if you'd be willing to travel and advise on their establishment. Elena considered the proposal carefully, her hand resting protectively on her growing belly. Only if we can ensure they're operated by people who truly understand what it means to feel powerless. People who remember in their bones what it feels like to desperately need help and have nowhere to turn. As the sun set over the Montana mountains, painting the snow-capped peaks in brilliant shades of gold and purple that seemed almost too beautiful to be real, Elena reflected on the incredible journey that had brought her to this moment of perfect contentment. From a woman sold for 2 mules and 5 horses, to the founder of a movement that would eventually change countless lives across the American West, her personal transformation had been complete and irreversible. But the most important transformation wasn't in her external circumstances or her social position within the community. It was in her fundamental understanding of what it truly meant to be free. Freedom wasn't simply the absence of oppression or the lack of physical constraints. It was the presence of genuine choice, the ability to determine your own destiny, and most importantly, the strength and resources to help others find their way to that same precious liberation. That evening, as they sat together by the fireplace in their comfortable parlor, Elena and Jacob began their nightly tradition of reading to the children from the collection of books that had grown to fill an entire wall of their home. Hope Rose nestled between them, her bright eyes fixed on the illustrations, while baby Daniel drowsed peacefully in Elena's arms. "Tell us the story about the brave princess who saved the kingdom," Hope Rose demanded, as she did every night. "That's not from any book," Jacob laughed, looking at his wife with undisguised adoration. "That's the story of your mother." As the fire burned low and the children finally succumbed to sleep, Elena and Jacob remained awake, talking quietly about their plans for expanding Harper House, about the legislation that Judge Harrison was proposing to better protect vulnerable women and children, about the family they were still building through love and commitment rather than mere blood relation. "Any regrets?" Jacob asked, as he did every year on their wedding anniversary and spontaneously on quiet evenings like this one. "Not a single one," Elena replied, as she always did. her voice carrying absolute truth. Everything we've endured brought us to this moment, to this family, to this purpose. I wouldn't change any of it. And in the warmth and safety of their home, surrounded by tangible evidence of lives well lived and love freely given and received, Elena Harper Mitchell knew with unshakable certainty that she had indeed found her way from the deepest darkness into the most brilliant light imaginable. The woman who had once been sold like property for 2 mules had become the architect of her own destiny and the protector of others who desperately needed the same chance she'd been given. And that transformation, Jacob knew as he watched his remarkable wife, made all the difference in a world that still contained too much cruelty, but also, thankfully, held infinite capacity for love, courage, and redemption. Epilogue. 1928, the fire had burned down to glowing embers in the parlor of the Mitchell Ranch. Jacob, now 77, finished his story and looked at his 15-year-old grandson, David, who sat mesmerized by the tale. "So that's how you really met great-grandmother Elena," David said softly. "She was sold for 2 mules, but she became the strongest woman in Montana Territory." "The strongest woman I ever knew," Jacob confirmed, "and the love of my life for 47 years. David looked at the faded photograph on the mantel. "Where is she now, grandfather?" Jacob's eyes grew distant. "Your great-grandmother passed peacefully last spring, son. She lived to see Harper House expand to 12 locations across the West. Over 5,000 women and children found safety because of her courage. Do you miss her?" "Every day," Jacob admitted, "but I'm grateful for every moment we had. She taught me that sometimes the best families aren't born, they're chosen. Just like we chose each other that winter day in 1881. Outside, the Montana snow continued to fall, but inside the warm ranch house, the legacy of Elena Harper Mitchell lived on in the stories passed down through generations. A reminder that even in the darkest winters, love and courage could triumph over cruelty and despair.